This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is Sunday the 5th, 2018, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, everything natural and conservation related.
I wanted to start with an article I pulled out of the Nature Conservancy. It was an article about poison ivy. Poison ivy has loomed rather large in my career. When you first come from another country, you are reserved about teaching your grandmother how to suck duck eggs. Now, let me explain that. If you have a grandma who paints pictures, European style, on eggs, as a young person, you don't tell your grandmother how to evacuate the egg so that you can paint on it. So you don't tell your grandmother how to suck duck eggs. So you don't tell people what to do with their natural areas if you're a neophyte. But I couldn't find the prairies, and I eventually saw people, children especially, sitting in the middle of poison ivy. And that made me think that they didn't really know much about their natural history and the prairie heritage. So I got bold and have ever since been game to tell people about their environment in the process of gaining some expertise, not a lot, but I can introduce people to that sort of situation. The article wanted to destroy a few myths about poison ivy. One is that it is very universal. It's in every state except Hawaii. And it has a chemical in it that humans are allergic to. One of the myths is that it is the only poison we have. But they had a diagram of mangoes. And if you eat mangoes and you come in contact with the skin, you encounter the same chemical, and it can give you sores on your lips. But so it's not necessarily only for one type of plant that the chemical exists, but it is mainly poison ivy, poison oak, sumac, and we get to know some of those plants that we respect. Another myth that is to the forefront is that you can be resistant to poison ivy. And there's some people who are bold enough to actually eat a leaf and demonstrate that they're not pro-poison ivy. But it tends to be an accumulated poison. And so if you don't get it when you're young, you may get it when you're older. You also have to make sure that other animals do eat poison ivy, and if you come in contact with them, then you're going to get some of that oil on you, and you're going to get poison ivy. There are certain birds that eat it, and there are also Your friendly dog may want to eat it, but your friendly dog may come back home and you will pet the dog and you'll get poison ivy. There's a feeling that if you have a dead piece of poison ivy, that it will not be viable in terms of the oil, but the oil is still there. So if you have a patch of poison ivy and you put it in the corner of your backyard and you come to it years later, you just might get poison ivy. Or if it's been underground and you've mown over the top of it for years and then you pull it up, you will get it too. There's always a little bit of delay. It might be a day or two before you get itchy, and then you get a watery blister, and that can be very painful. Also, if you are prone to burning rubbish or a natural area that has poison ivy in it, make sure that you're not standing in the smoke, because that smoke can be carrying the oil and gets into your lungs, and that's a rather dangerous way of getting poison ivy. There are people who have grown up with burning the ditches or inhaling the smoke and enjoying it. And you have to sometimes suggest to a farmer who's been used to doing that not to stand in the smoke, because it is burning poison ivy, and you'll get it if you're not careful. There's also a feeling that 3 leaves, let it be, and a little bit of red. That's a good way of looking at poison ivy, but also realize that poison ivy just doesn't live on the ground. In some cases, it will form a tree. It'll climb up a tree or dead stump, and the leaves are very large. The stems are sometimes an inch across, and that's a different form. There's a format where the poison ivy puts up spikes. There are attractive berries on poison ivy, and they're attractive to certain creatures that can handle a chemical. But there are people who also harvest poison ivy berries and put them into a dried arrangement, not realizing that what they've got. So be careful of the 3 leaves. Don't mix it up with Virginia creeper, which has 5 leaves. But Virginia creeper you need to watch also, because it can give you dermatitis. So it's summertime, and the poison ivy is doing quite well. If you're in the field, it's sometimes, and you know you're going to be dealing with poison ivy, wear Wellington boots so that you can wash them afterwards, the outside of them, and avoid getting poison ivy on your ankles. I think that gets my small rant about poison ivy. Just watch it, and don't be afraid of it. It likes to be in an area where it's sort of on the edge timber, where it has a little bit of shade. So often when the trees are removed, then you'll find poison ivy in the open territory, and that's when it likes to find a fence post or a tree to climb and it's a different cat, but it's still the same poison ivy, and be wary of it. Some people are more allergic to the chemical than others, so yes, there is a little bit of not everyone responding instantaneously to poison ivy. That's enough for that. And a couple of other local things. The 2nd Street Prairie, which was the pocket prairie across the road, is doing rather well. The grasses especially are growing. Culver's is growing. The rose is growing. So a lot of the broadleaves have come to their peak. So they look a little dead, but that's the nature of the prairie. The spiderwort, for instance, has bloomed and now is seeding. The lead plant, which was a shrub variety of lead plant, is growing. It took a lot of work to get it out and have enough roots on it for it to grow, but it's doing quite well. And there are lots of weeds. The plants were planted spot-wise, so there's space in between the plants, and there's various weeds that need to be removed, and we could use a little help doing that. The ginger and bloodroot are two plants that were in the forest expression of the prairie, and in the 2nd Street detention pond, we don't have the representative trees that will give it some shade. So they're looking rather sickly, and I suspect that they will go. I tried to put some Ceylon, which is it comes in various densities, so that you can give the plant some shade. But it's in a park district situation or a city situation that looks like a park, and Ceylon looks like it's an accidental piece of plastic, and so I don't think we can do that. But in time, we might find a little piece of prairie that is near a tree and can be expressing itself because it needs the shade. We've been removing teasel, and that's a constant job. There's just teasel all over. And now is the time for deadheading Canada thistle so it doesn't spread all over the place. We have a plot of Canada thistle at Lake Park, and we can use a little help there if you're willing and interested. My phone number is 840-1911, 217-840-1911. Now, I was wanting to say something about the building next door. We have been contacted for having code violations, and we do have. And I thought I'd run through a little bit of the history of that building, which is not unrelated to WEFT. I would say we sometimes is a royal we. Basically, I've been doing some of this, but it also involves hundreds of people who have been working with us for years, intermittently. They've gone on to other places. Sometimes they've reported that their life has changed because of what they've done with us. So I happen to be a leader in the push, but there have been a lot of volunteers and sometimes paid employees working with us. We started out in the university with the help of the curriculum lab, the Office of Instruction Resources, botany department, the environmental studies, and the Committee on Natural Areas, operating out of the Graduate College, and a number of departments. That sort of support was using contingency money. Contingency money is money that is assigned to departments, and departmental heads have the opportunity to use that money with their discretion. So sometimes we would be working with departments that wanted us to come and speak, or provide visual material, or run field trips, or teach laboratory sessions. So that was aided by the curriculum lab, which provided us with space. But the contingency money began to fade out, and the state wanted to have more control over contingency money. We had been working a lot with community agencies, and it was felt that appropriately we could move into the community and work there. We looked around for a site, and at that time, Champaign was virtually a dead central business district. The major industries, or the major commercial businesses, were moving to the malls. The malls were popular. They were moving fast, so fast the city was having to keep up with increasing mall space and box shops. There was an attempt to keep those key people, key businesses like Sears and Penny's in the downtown area. One of the things that was done was to provide parking, extra parking. So a Flatiron building between Main Street and Washington Street was removed to provide parking. But even so, Sears and Penny's went to the mall. There was another attempt, which was being initiated throughout the country, where a major street would be blocked off and converted to a downtown mall, again to encourage local involvement. So the area between Neal Street and Chestnut, near the city building, a matter of probably a quarter of a mile, was converted into a mall space with roofing and interesting areas for artists and others to present. It did block off the major through traffic that went down Neal Street to South 45. So some of the traffic had to go around and find their way around that mall. The mall, as other malls in the country, were eventually not as successful as was hoped. And so it took $1 million to put that mall in and $1 million to take it out. So now the traffic comes through Neal Street directly. And the city is in the process of working on the corridor, which is Neal Street, as it comes from 74, Route 74 interstate, down through Champaign to Route 45. it's got its moments because there's some bottlenecks, but the planners and others within the city are really trying to do a good job of getting traffic off of 74 and down and through Champaign. You can't always hope that that would include major highway traffic. So I've been in towns where there's been a move to have the general traffic go through town instead of around the town. So the major highway goes right through town with the hope that the traffic would stop, but it doesn't really stop. The semi-trailer that's going from woe to go is not really going to stop in your town, and that somewhat destroys the opportunity for the wee folk, little folk, to express themselves with art or whatever that you're going to sell. So I'm in favor of 57 going around Rantoul or around Paxton or places like that. Well, when we were looking for a place, there were 4 buildings on Market Street that were empty. You have to know that as people were moving to the mall, there was also an industrial change. Early on, when we first came here, there was actually a linotype machine in the News Gazette building, and you would form your letters in lead and put them into a block, and you would use a press to roll across that. You would ink the top, and then you would roll the press on top of paper. A slow process, but it was replaced by offset press and then by rotogravure. But the engraving industry was moving out. So if you look at the history for downtown, you have 2 blocks of 100-foot long buildings, all brick. There's one that faces Market Street, one that faces Walnut Street. Those buildings replaced wooden buildings were lost to fire when the weather dried up or in wintertime when there was heaters and things dried up. So the buildings were replaced by brick. The Grubb family engravers came to this area in the mid-50s from Decatur, and gradually they expanded and occupied 8 buildings in this area, one of which is what WEF occupies right now. Those 8 buildings also spanned an alleyway that was 40 feet wide and had been closed. So at the south end, there was Dan's hat shop built across the alley. And further up, there were sites where the Grubb industry had built across the alleyway and had connectivity between the Walnut row of 8 buildings and the Market Street row of 8 buildings. They didn't own all of them, they owned a lot of them. And they had dark rooms and heavy equipment. We have one press still we eventually took over, came to this place. Perhaps I'll talk about that a little later. Market Street was a rather rough and tough street. People would come out from out of town and bring their check and So there was lots of drinking and bar activities, a brothel here and there. There was theaters. You brought your horses and left them in a livery stable. You brought your harness to a harness factory, which was just up the road. And you might have gone to Chicago because by that time, by 1870, you had a railroad which started in the 1850s and went through the Civil War and came out of that with a different era. If you went to Chicago, you could come back and gather up your horses and your harnesses and leave town. But Market Street at that time was had some control by the mafioso. So it was an interesting street. We felt that we could probably contribute to the well-being of the street. We could also have the advantage of low rental. At one stage, we could have bought 2 of these buildings for $45,000. Right now, you couldn't buy one building for $150,000. Now the gentrification is occurring. So we looked at 2 of these buildings, and for quite some time, we occupied 2 buildings. And we were very pleased to do that. The street had an interesting group of people. News Gazette was at the north end. There's a large Lincoln building, which was designed for lawyers, and there's still lawyers there. There's currently there's something like 20 artists there. Came back down the street a little bit, and there were 2 buildings that were early buildings put up when the railroad first came, and materials and luggage and stuff that was left on the railroad bed was subject to theft. So to those 2 buildings just north of Taylor Street were where you would store equipment, materials, and luggage. The people who controlled it would live upstairs. So those 2 buildings are historic buildings and may have predated the 2 sets of 8 buildings that were built opposite Market and Walnut. Come a little further south, and you had, at one stage, Robeson's had their appliance store in a building across the way. That building has currently been bought. We're sort of hoping that it might remain as a historic building and be modified for whatever use it might be put to. But it may be destroyed for a more modern building. What has happened is that the malls have not been as popular as thought recently, and people have come back to downtown. The apartments have grown, and the downtown Champaign is a work in progress and very active. And buildings like the building that we and Weft are occupying are a little older, and they need attention. Our own building has not received a lot of attention because our trade is not awfully lucrative, and we don't have the money to do that. So looking at the front, you look up and you see where there was a jut out that was used so that you could look along the street and know who was there. In some places there's a speakeasy where people would I'd be on the second floor, and they'd open a little window and look down to see who was coming in and if that was appropriate. In some places, there's a bullet hole or two. So when we came, there were lots of stories. The Grubb family had stories about the things that will go on in this area. And we also tried to run Audubon-type programs, and we found that that was not awfully successful, partially because the people who knew Market Street did not send their young folk down Market Street. They may have come, but it wasn't the, it was a little on the raunchy side. But that was 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, and we've been very pleased to be here. At just down the road from Weft, there was Celie Johnson, a highly respected senior citizen who ran a sports store, and his son ran a tavern just north of that. Across the road, there was a Piccadilly liquor store, which was replaced by a furniture store, and eventually the Champagne Visitor Bureau moved in. So there was a community here that was interested in art and education and the science of biology and preserving the gene pool, which was down to very little left. The building across the way that was occupied by the Visitor Bureau had a battle axe-shaped plot of land that was not used very much. It had been the site of two 30-foot billboards that didn't conform to modern regulations regarding how big a sign should be adjacent to a federal highway, which is University Avenue, just a few hundred feet away. So those two billboards were grandfathered in. That meant they were allowed to maintain their dignity with the previous rules for 10 years. And then they had to go to a smaller sign that faced Chestnut Street. That left a rather nicely terraced landscape. It was terraced for the billboards and the growth of urban weeds. We looked at that and felt that we could use that for a pocket prairie, and did so. It was designed to simulate a prairie so that we could introduce people to a prairie without their having to go 20 miles to a decent prairie. We had a lot of help putting in serviceberry trees, which are not necessarily shrubs, but they're small trees, and they are not about to lift the buildings around them up with their roots. So we created a simulated prairie forest with the forest had the structure of a typical forest. It had trees, shrubs, herbs, and vines. And so, and as you went out to the edge timber, when trees are stacked by them together, they tend to grow tall. When you open them to the light, they tend to make a savanna or make an edge timber. And the animals that are in the prairie, using the prairie for food will come back to that edge timber to nest and to protect themselves. Early settlers would settle in the woods, not in the prairie. But as you came through that edge timber, we had a little conversation area, which was a nice retreat for many people. But then you ran into the prairie. It were close to the trees. It had a little shade, and so some plants would sort themselves out there. The likes of purple coneflower like to be perhaps 25 feet from the edge, but they like a little bit of shade. Most of the prairie was wanting full sun, and you could tell that because when they grew, they would lean out towards the sunlight. But it was typical of a prairie. It had a little trail around it. You could take a 2-minute walk and actually close your eyes and feel for what it was like to have thousands and thousands of acres of prairie. We had a compass plant which would allow settlers to know what was north and south. Otherwise, if they were to ride 100 miles, they would be back on the doorstep. That's just the way human brains work. So they needed to know where the north and south was, and this plant helped. We had dock and compass plant and monarda and baptisia and clover, and it just not a wide range because the soil was not a good prairie soil. It was originally Goose Lake Pond when Champaign was first settled, and the railroad came through 7 miles west of Urbana. So this was west of Urbana for some time, and then became Champaign. Both names come from Ohio, where you have an Urbana and you have a Champaign County, I think, in Ohio. But the names came from that direction. And the university had been located here because over on Green Street there was a seminary of types, and so there was already a building there, and the seminary closed, and there was a lot of debate about where the University of Illinois as a cow college would be located. And cow college being an institution that would work with the community. It would have agricultural extension, it would have engineering extension, it would deal with schooling, and so the university was in the midst between Urbana and Champaign. The little prairie that we had was right in the middle of all this, and it's rather amazing, and people would walk past it for years and all of a sudden discover it to the amazement. And it did a lot of educating. It has recently been removed because the battle axe-shaped plot is going to be a beer garden for a bar that is Poor Brothers Tap. And it will have custom beers, and we're rather pleased to see it there because the building has been empty for a long time. And these are 3 younger people who have a bar in Peoria, and it looks like they were doing very well there and would like to do the same here. There's been a little bit of debate about putting a walkway through from Market Street to Chestnut Street, but that hasn't happened. And there's a tiny little piece of prairie on the Chestnut end that will remain. There's been some land debate about who owns what, and this has delayed the creation of the beer garden. The bar may open. It may even be open at the time of Wefest, is somewhere, I think, 16th of September. David is nodding, so I'll repeat that. WEF Fest will be on the 16th of September. So things are changing in downtown. But over the years, our building next door to WEF has been interesting and helpful. Early on, we applied to the Kresge Foundation to see if we could have 4 not-for-profit organizations located here. And it would seem to fit into the range of other businesses that were already here. And the Kresge Foundation response was that it was a good idea, but as non-profit agencies, we didn't have collateral, which would mean that if the idea failed, there was no backup resource to save the soul of the Kresge business if it invested in this sort of thing. We kept going, though. We did have a finger in the pie of having WEF to come here. Bill Taylor and others were interested, and long before there was a WEF on Market Street, there was a WEF operating out of a banner, I think. I don't remember exactly, but there was an IG8 store that was taken over by Time Warner because a banner had said that if public television was going to come in, it would need to have that public element. And so they were stationed there for some time. Then there was a move afoot to have early WEF. Bill Thomas was a mover and shaker in this event. And there was an Oddfellows building opposite the city building. And so working with Mr. Krause, father of the musician.
Allison?
Allison.
Interesting.
And I remember meeting there. I remember Rubel being involved. Later, Mark Rubel would buy, or his mother would buy a building to the north, which we vacated, and we went back to just one building, mainly because it was sprinkled, and we were doing things like silkscreen printing, and it was helpful to have that fire protection. Mark was running a sound studio, and his work related to many of the musicians that came to be involved with WEF. So just to the south of us, there was a Metrotech, which was a test and measurement agency, which also filled in the educational, artist, science type activity on this corridor. Gradually over the years, we've done a lot of things out of that building, and we would like the code enforcement people to understand that and to understand our limited funds and how can we put this tapestry together and preserve it. It could well be the building could be sold as a bar, or and so we almost think that there's probably enough bars in Champaign already, but things are changing, and so we have to work with the city because codes are there for a very good reason, and we do have an accumulation of items. To a large extent, our work has been in the field. When we created little prairies, like at Lake Park, there's 2.5 acres. And we encouraged people like the Barnhart family to put in a prairie, Donald Barnhart came firstly as a student in a high school class, and we introduced him and the class to a prairie that was on South 45. Later, the Barnhart family had a farm on Yankee Ridge, and they had a slope, and slope land erodes. So you have the opportunity to put that sloped land into a set-aside. And so Donald came and asked if I would talk to Father about the possibility of putting in a prairie. We put in 1.5 acres of prairie. It was in a circle, and Father was quite in agreement, but we wanted to make a statement about where the prairie was because the seed wasn't going to grow very quickly. So we took a plant, evening primrose, which grows within a year, and we circled that 1.5 acres with evening primrose so that it would be known where the 1.5 acres was. And Father was willing, and Harry Barnhart, and he modified his combine so that we could work with that. We put in plots of big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, and other plants, and that harvester was used to harvest the seed. And over the years, Donald has put in plots of specific plants that are still there, and the family has been in agreement, and they now have 100 acres of prairie. It's a little on the rough, tough side, but it's a wonderful experience. They at one stage hoped they might get 400 acres of prairie. This soil and water conservation people and NREFs have been in compliance and interested. They've helped to burn, and there's a little parking lot. If you go down Vine Street and turn towards Savoy, you can find a little parking lot and walk around that prairie. The family is currently putting in a farm building and putting in a restaurant so that you can visit the prairie and enjoy it and look over the Ombra and the river that runs out of this area and to Savoy. At the time we were losing prairie on South 45 to road widening. It went from 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 5 lanes, and Donald picked up quite a bit of remnant prairie that he put in plots. It's more recently that land has been resumed by the university for 8 square mile of land that to the south of the university. But that prairie area has been dedicated for a future. So one way and another, we have encouraged people to look at their prairies and preserve them. At one stage, the railroad between Champaign, Whiteheath, Monticello, Cisco, and Decatur was going to be vacated in part. The line went north from Decatur to Clinton and then came back through Lane, Weldon, Deland, Shady Rest, and Whiteheath, and then came back into Champaign. So it had gone from being a major railroad line trying to get across the country and to Havana and getting the aim of many railroads was to be the first to get across the country. And this was the Havana, Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad. So this railroad was about to be abandoned in pieces. So the Railroad Museum in Monticello bought 7 miles of the land, the railroad intact. And they had already occupied an adjacent interurban line. They had probably about a mile of active line where they could take a steam engine up to the top of the Cerro Gordo Moraine and bring people back down. So it was popular. And, so they bought their 7 miles. We bought 4 miles from Whiteheath to Seymour and 6 miles between Monticello and Cisco. That last piece went along by Allerton Park and had good prairie on it. The aim was to encourage rails, trails, and greenways.
4 minutes.
Wow. So we got involved in buying that, had donations, and then Mrs. Price at Shady Rest wanted to support that and preserve the dignity of one of 3 truss bridges we have, 27 trestles, and prairie on either side of a ballast that runs all the way to Clinton from Whiteheath and crosses the Sangamon 2 times, one at Monticello, and Monticello has put in at 2 miles of trail, which is very popular, and Allerton Park has put in prairie alongside the railroad bed prairie to encourage Massasauga rattler snakes that are endangered and are in that area. Shady Rest has gone 30 acres to Piatt County Forest Preserve, and we're still dealing with the area to Clinton where the railroad bed goes through 2 parts of Weldon Springs State Park. So this is buying land that won't be developed immediately, but if we didn't buy it when the opportunity arose, it wouldn't be there. So coming back to the building on Market Street, that building has encouraged that sort of involvement. A little later, when there was a Rail Banking Act, and we could buy land from Urbana to Danville, Heartland Pathways was instrumental in taking out an interim trail agreement, which eventually has led to a lot of community action and the creation of a Kickapoo Trail. So all in all, we have done a lot of work from that building, and we hope to continue that work. It's a tapestry of things that we have done. We've included artwork and involvement with historic buildings, and we hope that you folk out there will understand what we're doing and why, and perhaps even be able to help us with support for what we're doing, whether it be at Rantoul to Paxton and other places. I think we're
1 minute.
Okay,
1 minute and a half, actually.
almost there. So I'm at the moment writing up this information. In there is a royal we. I happen to be committed to doing this, but it has involved over the years hundreds of different people. David himself is a volunteer engineering this radio program, which ends up on Havana Public Television and on YouTube. Before that, Bill Saylor was doing the same thing for 18 years. it sometimes takes us 4 hours, maybe in special cases 10 hours, to put pictures into these programs. And so that all happens next door. So can we continue doing that? We hope we can continue that activity. And we hope that you will understand what we're doing. And if possible, we want to fix the front facade, fix the coding violations with accumulated stuff. We've done a lot of preservation of recyclable materials, and that is another aspect of our work that operates out of that building. It's in an area that's been gentrified. So that's all for now. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else. And I'll mention, Dave mentioned that you can actually watch this video, of a radio program? Yes, because when it goes online at YouTube, for example, we have added videos and pictures to show you maps and things as Dave describes all of these things. So if you go to YouTube and type in The Prairie Monk, you can find an entire channel of videos that show these things. But maybe you've just missed listening to the radio program one Sunday morning and you just want to hear it. If you go to weft.org, you have to burrow just a little bit, look under shows, and it will point you to our public affairs page. And WEFT actually keeps audio files, the air checks as we call them, of all of our locally created public affairs programs. So you can go to that page, find the Prairie Monk, and listen at your will to just the audio versions of all of these shows going back quite a few years now. It's now afternoon. You're tuned to WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. We are community radio for East Central Illinois.